I never thought a simple dare could turn into one of the strangest, most enlightening nights of my life. It all started on a lazy Saturday afternoon, when my best friend Mark and I were lounging in his cramped living room, scrolling aimlessly through social media and making fun of the endless challenge videos people kept posting. He leaned back, smirking, a mischievous glint in his eye. "What if we did one of those?" he said. "You know, the ridiculous ones, just to see how far we'd go." I laughed, assuming he meant something like eating gross things or trying some impossible stunt. But no. His fingers tapped a bookmarked page on his phone, and he turned it toward me with a grin I should have known better than to trust. It was a video titled The Ultimate Crossdressing Challenge, 2 Guys, 1 Corset. At first, I laughed until I nearly spilled my soda. Mark, on the other hand, was all business. "Come on," he said. "We've got nothing else to do, and think of the story we'll have. 2 guys, 1 corset. See how far we can go." I tried to resist, but something in the way he said it, half challenge, half invitation, made it impossible to refuse. There was a thrill to the idea, even if it terrified me. The plan was absurdly simple. Mark had already borrowed a corset from his sister's costume box, and would take turns seeing who could fit into it and present themselves as convincingly feminine as possible. There was an unspoken rule that it wasn't about looking perfect, it was about commitment, courage, and somehow, transformation. I felt a twinge of anxiety creeping in, a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. Was I ready to let go of the familiar version of myself, even just for a few hours? Mark went first. He disappeared into his bedroom, leaving me in the living room, nervously pacing and pretending to be nonchalant. When he returned, I barely recognized him. The corset hugged him tightly, forcing his posture to straighten unnaturally. His shoulders seemed narrower, his chest subtly compressed, and the way he walked, careful, deliberate, almost exaggerated, made him look like someone else entirely. "Your turn," he said, smirking, and handed me the corset. I froze. Holding it in my hands, I realized how intimate this tiny piece of fabric was, how much it would demand from me. "Are you sure this is safe?" I asked, half joking, half serious. Mark laughed, the sound echoing through the tiny living room. "You'll survive," he said, "and maybe even enjoy it." That simple phrase, "maybe even enjoy it," sent a shiver down my spine. Sliding into the corset was a challenge I hadn't anticipated. The clasps were tricky, and each tightening made me acutely aware of my own body. My breathing felt shallow, my movements restricted, yet somehow liberating. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and nearly laughed out loud. The person staring back was unmistakably me, yet different in ways I couldn't fully articulate. My chest compressed, my waist pinched, and my posture forced me upright in a way that felt both awkward and oddly elegant. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also powerful, in a strange, unfamiliar sense. Mark cheered me on, his enthusiasm infectious. "Own it," he shouted. And for a moment, I did. I moved slowly, feeling the strange sway of my hips and the tiny shifts in balance the corset demanded. Every step was an exercise in self-awareness, a tiny negotiation with the person I thought I knew. It was like walking a tightrope between who I was and who I was pretending to be. And then, as the initial shock wore off, I noticed something unexpected. I was laughing. Really laughing. Not the nervous kind, but that light, unguarded laugh that bubbles up when you're doing something completely ridiculous and yet completely thrilling. Mark joined in, and soon we were both doubling over, tears streaming down our faces from the sheer absurdity of it all. But underneath the laughter, there was something quieter, deeper, stirring in me. A curiosity about identity, appearance, and the boundaries of comfort that I had never allowed myself to explore before. By the time we paused to catch our breath, the living room had transformed in our minds. It wasn't just a place to hang out anymore, it was a stage, a laboratory for self-discovery. The corset had become more than a piece of clothing. It was a key, unlocking doors I hadn't realized were there. And as I looked at Mark, I saw the same flicker of fascination mirrored in his eyes. This wasn't just a challenge anymore. It was a journey, and we were only just beginning. I hesitated before stepping fully into the living room again, the corset tightening around my torso like a firm, relentless reminder that I wasn't just playing dress-up. I was performing, experimenting, and exposing myself all at once. Mark had taken off his jacket and thrown on a scarf, adding a touch of drama to his already transformed appearance. He was pacing now, like an actor testing the stage, and I felt a rush of nervous energy as I followed suit. The mirror became both our friend and our critic. Mark positioned himself beside it, watching my every move with a grin that was part encouragement, part mischief. "You look different," he said, choosing his words carefully, like someone I might actually notice on the street. His comment made my chest tighten, not just from the corset, but from the sudden awareness of being seen, really seen, in this altered state. I laughed nervously, trying to shrug off the weight of his gaze. "Different, huh?" I muttered. "I feel ridiculous." But even as I said it, I realized that the corset forced me to stand taller, to walk with intention. Each step I took was deliberate, calculated, yet increasingly fluid. There was a strange elegance to it, a rhythm I hadn't anticipated. My movements became a dance, subtle yet hypnotic, and I couldn't help but notice the way Mark's eyes followed me, curious, maybe even impressed. We decided to take things further. Mark grabbed an assortment of scarves, hats, and makeup from his sister's room, and soon we were each experimenting with our faces, reshaping our appearances in real time. I watched in fascination as Mark applied blush with meticulous care, transforming his angular jawline into something softer, more approachable. When it was my turn, my hands trembled slightly as I traced the contours of my own face, experimenting with shadows and highlights that emphasized features I'd never paid attention to. Something strange happened in that moment. Looking at my reflection, I began to notice details I had never appreciated: the curve of my cheekbone, the slope of my jaw, the way my eyes caught the light differently when framed by subtle makeup. It was as if I was seeing myself anew, not through the lens of vanity or insecurity, but through curiosity and experimentation. There was a thrill in it, a quiet satisfaction in reshaping the familiar into something unfamiliar yet undeniably me. Mark laughed suddenly, breaking the spell. "You look unstoppable," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, not from the corset, not just from the makeup, but from the validation of being seen and admired in a completely unexpected way. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. I realized that I had been holding back, hiding parts of myself even from my closest friend, and now, in this absurd little living room experiment, those berries were dissolving. We spent the next hour exploring this new version of ourselves, taking turns adjusting the corset, experimenting with different hairstyles, and striking poses that felt absurdly theatrical. The living room became a stage, the mirror our audience, and every laugh, every stumble, every awkward shift in balance a moment of revelation. I noticed the way the corset forced me to engage with my body differently, every motion measured, every gesture heightened. It was a strange intimacy, a conversation between fabric and flesh that I had never experienced before. As the afternoon wore on, something unexpected happened. The challenge, which had started as a ridiculous dare, began to feel meaningful. I realized that beneath the laughter, the theatrics, and the absurdity, there was a quiet lesson in identity, courage, and self-expression. The corset, the scarves, the makeup, they weren't just props. They were tools, keys to unlocking parts of ourselves we had ignored or dismissed. And for the first time, I felt a thrill not just from the transformation, but from the possibility of who I could be if I allowed myself to explore freely. Mark leaned back against the couch, looking at me with a mixture of pride and mischief. "You know," he said, "we might actually pull this off. Not just the challenge, but this. We're kind of incredible." I laughed, feeling a surge of confidence I hadn't anticipated, and realized that the room, the mirror, the corset, and even the nervous tension between us had created something magical. Something transformative. By the time evening crept in, the living room had become a world of its own. A private theater where Mark and I were both actors and audience, suspended somewhere between absurd comedy and genuine self-discovery. The sunlight fading through the blinds painted stripes across the floor, and I noticed how the shadows danced over the contours of my corseted body, accentuating shapes I had never really considered before. Every movement was deliberate now, every sway of my hips, every turn of my head, a negotiation with this new version of myself. Mark was beside me, experimenting with a wide-brimmed hat he'd found. He tilted it dramatically, squinting at the mirror. "You know," he said, "I feel like we're not just doing a challenge anymore. This is art." I laughed, a little nervously, because the idea felt half ridiculous and half exhilaratingly true. There was a strange pride in it, a secret satisfaction in seeing us fully committed to the absurdity. And yet, underneath the humor, a quiet tension lingered. I realized that trying to embody someone so dramatically different from myself wasn't just playful, it was intimate, even vulnerable. I caught my reflection again, this time more closely. The corset had molded me into something both familiar and alien. My shoulders were drawn back, my posture forced into elegance, my stomach compressed in a way that made me hyper-aware of every inch of my body. I touched my waist, feeling the narrowness and the pressure, and a strange thrill ran through me. It wasn't just discomfort, it was transformation, a reminder that sometimes, change is uncomfortable before it becomes exhilarating. Mark leaned closer, examining my face. "You're good at this," he said softly, almost shyly. I blinked, surprised by the tone in his voice. It wasn't mockery or teasing. It was genuine observation, a recognition that somehow, beneath the laughter and chaos, I was embodying something real. That simple acknowledgement sent a jolt through me, a mix of pride and nervousness. We decided to push ourselves further. If the challenge was about immersion, then we weren't going to stop at corsets and scarves. We experimented with posture, gestures, and expressions. I tried tilting my head just so, lifting my chin slightly, and letting my eyes soften, while Mark practiced subtle smiles and fluid hand movements. It felt awkward at first, almost like learning a dance I didn't know the steps to. But gradually, the motions became natural, flowing from our bodies without conscious thought. There were moments of laughter and embarrassment, of course. I tripped slightly over the edge of the carpet, almost toppling into the coffee table, and Mark doubled over in laughter. Then it was my turn to point out how dramatically he'd overdone the eyeliner. Yet even in these small, ridiculous mishaps, there was a rhythm, a connection between us. We were both learning, both exploring, both daring to step outside comfort zones that normally defined us. As the night deepened, something unexpected settled over the room. It wasn't just the thrill of transformation or the absurdity of two grown men squeezing into a single corset challenge. It was a sense of intimacy, not romantic, not sexual, but profoundly human. We were exposing ourselves, not physically in a vulnerable way, but emotionally. Allowing ourselves to be seen in a way that defied our usual masks, and discovering that it felt freeing. By the time we finally paused, exhausted from laughter, experimentation, and the sheer effort of holding ourselves in ways our bodies weren't accustomed to, the living room felt like hallowed ground. The corset had done its work. It had forced us upright, pushed us into elegance, and in doing so, had loosened invisible chains we hadn't even known we were carrying. I caught my reflection one last time before stepping out of it, feeling a mixture of relief, pride, and a twinge of melancholy. There was something powerful about being someone else, if only temporarily, and the thought of returning to my normal self felt almost bittersweet. Mark sat beside me, sipping water and grinning like a conspirator in a secret he couldn't wait to share. "So," he said, "we survived the challenge, huh?" I nodded, though inside, I knew we hadn't just survived. We had transformed. Not just outwardly, but inwardly, in ways that would linger long after the corset was folded away. And as I looked at him, I realized that the challenge had never really been about a corset. It had been about courage, curiosity, and the strange joy of stepping outside the box you've built around yourself. The next morning, I woke up with a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. The previous day's adventure in Mark's living room had left its mark, not just on my body, stiff and sore from hours in the corset, but on my mind. I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from the night before. The tentative first steps in the corset, the careful adjustments of makeup, the laughter that had echoed through the room like a private symphony. And yet, even as I smiled at the memory, there was a lingering question. What had I truly learned from all of this? I met Mark at the kitchen table, both of us nursing mugs of coffee, our casual morning attire starkly contrasting the elaborate transformations of the night before. There was a quiet understanding between us, a shared glance that said more than words ever could. Neither of us mentioned the corset, not yet, but the experience hung in the air like a secret only we could comprehend. "Morning," Mark said finally, breaking the silence. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms above his head, and grinned. "Still thinking about last night?" I nodded. Yeah, it felt bigger than I expected. Not just funny or weird. It felt, I don't know, like something shifted. He laughed softly, a warm sound that made me feel both comforted and exposed at once. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "It's like we were someone else, but not really someone else. We were still us, just freer somehow." I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth ground me, and realized he was right. The corset, the scarves, the makeup, it wasn't just a costume. It had been a lens, a mirror, and a magnifying glass all at once. Through it, I had confronted my own insecurities, my curiosity, and even my hidden playfulness. And the fact that Mark had been there, laughing, encouraging, experimenting alongside me, had made the experience feel safe, intimate, and transformative all at once. After breakfast, we decided to review the photos we'd taken the night before. At first, it was hilarious, outrageous poses, exaggerated expressions, the occasional stumble caught mid-frame. But as we scrolled further, something surprising happened. There were moments, fleeting and subtle, where we looked confident, elegant, alive in a way that transcended the absurdity of the challenge. I stared at a picture of myself in the corset, cheeks flushed, eyes wide and focused, and felt an unfamiliar pride. This wasn't just a costume. This was a version of me I hadn't allowed myself to fully see before. Mark noticed my expression and nudged the phone toward me. "See? Told you it wasn't just funny," he said. "There's something real here." I nodded slowly, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Yeah," I admitted softly. "Real and kind of thrilling. In a weird, terrifying way." He laughed, and I joined in, the sound echoing through the kitchen, light and free. By midday, we were back in the living room, unable to resist the pull of yesterday's experiment. This time, we approached it differently. Instead of rushing straight into the corset or makeup, we took time to explore subtle changes, different ways of standing, small shifts in posture, nuanced gestures. It was less about the spectacle and more about embodiment. Every movement became deliberate, a way to understand how the smallest adjustments could transform perception, even if only in ourselves. There were moments of self-consciousness, of course. I caught myself hesitating before reaching for a scarf, wondering how it would change my appearance, my presence. But Mark's encouraging nods reminded me that this was a judgment-free zone, a space where curiosity and courage mattered more than perfection. The realization hit me that the challenge had never been about being flawless. It had been about daring to try, daring to feel, and daring to embrace the unfamiliar with a sense of wonder rather than fear. As the afternoon light shifted through the blinds, the room took on a softer, almost magical quality. The mirror reflected more than just our physical transformations. It reflected curiosity, camaraderie, and courage. And in that reflection, I began to understand a profound truth. Transformation isn't just about outward appearance. It's about willingness, vulnerability, and the courage to step into something unknown, knowing that the process itself can teach you more than the outcome ever could. Mark caught my gaze across the room, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "Ready for round two?" he asked, the gleam in his eyes betraying the same mix of mischief and curiosity that had sparked this entire adventure. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't just ready for another round of corsets, scarves, and laughter. I was ready to see how far this journey could take us. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the floor, Mark and I decided to make the next phase of our challenge a little more structured. We laid out a lineup of outfits, accessories, and makeup options on the couch, as if preparing for a fashion show with no audience except ourselves. Each piece seemed to hold its own potential for transformation, and the energy in the room shifted from playful chaos to focused anticipation. I picked up the corset again, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. It no longer felt foreign or intimidating. Instead, it was a tool, a frame that allowed me to explore possibilities I'd never considered. I slid into it slowly, adjusting the clasps with deliberate care. Every tightening pulled me into a new posture, one that was upright, alert, and strangely graceful. Mark watched, offering pointers with his trademark enthusiasm, his eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and admiration. When it was my turn to style my hair and apply makeup, I hesitated for a split second, recalling the nervous fumbling of the first night. But the hesitation was brief. This time, I was more deliberate, experimenting with subtle highlights, eyeliner, and contouring. With each brushstroke, I felt more in control, more confident. It was a curious sensation, vulnerability and empowerment mingling in a way that made me feel alive. I caught my reflection mid-application and couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. It wasn't just the corset or the makeup, it was the intention behind every movement, every detail, that made it compelling. Mark, in his turn, approached the mirror with a kind of theatrical flourish. He draped a flowing scarf over his shoulders, adjusted his hat, and applied just enough blush to soften his features. Watching him, I realized how invested we both were, not in perfection, but in exploration. Every adjustment, every posture shift, was a conversation with ourselves, a way to understand the fluidity of identity and appearance. The living room, once ordinary, had become a laboratory of self-expression. We took turns walking across the room, testing our transformations, observing how each stance, each tilt of the head, changed not only our own perception but the way we were reflected back in the mirror. I noticed subtle things about Mark, the tilt of his chin, the curve of his shoulders, the way his eyes seemed larger, softer. And I realized that I was noticing the same in myself. Each movement became intentional, each gesture a tiny experiment in presence and persona. At one point, Mark and I both froze, mid-step, staring at our reflections. There was a moment of silence, almost reverent, as if the room itself held its breath. We weren't laughing or joking, we were simply observing, recognizing the strange power of the transformations we had created. It was more than dress-up, it was self-exploration, a way to see ourselves anew through playful yet thoughtful experimentation. Then, laughter broke the tension. I tripped slightly on the edge of the rug, nearly tipping over, and Mark doubled over, hands on his knees. I joined in, the sound echoing warmly around the room. But even as we laughed, there was a lingering sense of awe. The absurdity of the challenge had created something unexpected, an intimacy not of romance, but of shared vulnerability and discovery. As the evening wore on, we decided to up the stakes. We challenged each other to embody different personas, one soft and delicate, one bold and commanding, and one quirky and mischievous. Each persona demanded changes not just in clothing or makeup, but in posture, movement, and expression. It was exhausting and exhilarating, a mental and physical workout that pushed us further into the realm of self-awareness and performance. By the end of the night, both of us were panting from laughter and effort, our reflections in the mirror showing a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. We had pushed ourselves, explored boundaries, and discovered facets of our identities we hadn't considered. The corset, once a simple piece of fabric, had become a catalyst for courage, curiosity, and playful exploration. Mark collapsed onto the couch, still grinning. "I think we've officially outdone ourselves," he said. I nodded, feeling a swell of satisfaction and something more, a quiet pride in daring to step into the unknown and fully commit to it. The challenge was no longer about who looked better or who could endure more discomfort. It was about transformation, connection, and the joy of discovering new dimensions of ourselves, together. The following morning, the living room felt different, quiet, almost contemplative. The chaos of scarves, hats, and makeup brushes from the night before had been tidied up, but the traces of transformation lingered in the air. I found myself staring at the mirror again, curious to see how much of what I had discovered about myself would remain after the corset and the makeup were gone. Mark was already there, sipping his coffee, and the faint shadow of a grin suggested he had been thinking the same thing. "Ready for another round?" he asked, though the question wasn't quite playful this time. There was a seriousness to it, an acknowledgement that the challenge had evolved beyond jokes and dares. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the pull of both excitement and vulnerability. Then I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I want to see how far we can take this." This time, we decided to add more elements, subtle gestures, character-building movements, even experimenting with voice. The corset went on first, as always, but the approach felt different. I adjusted it slowly, mindfully, taking note of how it reshaped my posture, altered my breathing, and changed my sense of balance. It was a physical challenge, yes, but also a meditation, a way of anchoring myself in a form that demanded awareness. Mark experimented with voice first. He altered pitch and tone, trying to match the persona he was embodying. At first, it felt silly, even forced, but soon, the sound began to match the movements, the posture, and the expression. I watched, fascinated, as his confidence grew with each adjustment. Then it was my turn. I hesitated, aware of the unnaturalness of it, but slowly, I began to modulate my own voice, experimenting with softness, inflection, and cadence. The effect was subtle but profound. I sounded different to myself, and in turn, I felt different. We moved around the room, practicing coordinated gestures and expressions, testing how the smallest motions could dramatically alter our perceived identities. Each tilt of the head, sway of the hips, or lift of an eyebrow became a tiny revelation. We laughed at ourselves, of course, but beneath the humor was an emerging awareness, a sense that we were discovering parts of ourselves that had been dormant, hidden, or unexplored. As we paused, Mark looked at me with a quiet intensity. "You know," he said, "this is weirdly freeing. I feel like I can actually breathe in this version of me." I nodded, understanding completely. The corset, the scarves, the makeup, even the voice exercises, they weren't constraints. They were tools that allowed us to see ourselves differently, to inhabit identities that felt authentic in their own strange way. We decided to push boundaries further. Each persona now required not just external transformation, but a story, a brief backstory that influenced the way we moved, spoke, and even felt. I became someone thoughtful, reserved, and graceful, while Mark embraced a bold, daring, and mischievous character. Walking across the room, gesturing, and speaking as these personas felt like acting. Yes, but also like uncovering hidden aspects of ourselves we hadn't named before. There were moments of self-doubt, of course. I caught myself wondering if I looked ridiculous, or if Mark was judging me, even silently. But each time, I reminded myself of the journey we had undertaken together, the laughter, the encouragement, the shared curiosity. And each time, I found courage, embracing the discomfort as a necessary part of discovery. By the time evening arrived, we were exhausted but exhilarated. The living room, once ordinary, had become a sacred space for experimentation, revelation, and friendship. The corset, scarves, hats, and makeup had served as catalysts, but the real transformation was internal, a willingness to explore, to play, and to accept the unexpected lessons that came from stepping outside the familiar. Mark flopped back onto the couch, grinning like a conspirator in a long, wonderful secret. "We've come a long way," he said. I smiled, feeling a strange, warm satisfaction. "Yeah," I replied softly, "and I don't think it's just about the challenge anymore. It's more than that. It's about who we can become, even if only for a moment." By the 7th day of our experiment, the living room felt less like a room and more like a stage, a sanctuary where exploration and play were not just allowed but celebrated. We had grown familiar with the corset, with the scarves, with the subtle art of makeup and posture, and yet each session continued to surprise us. Every tilt of the head, every breath constrained by the corset, every small adjustment of eyeliner or scarf revealed something unexpected about how we carried ourselves, how we perceived ourselves, and how the other perceived us. This time, Mark suggested something different. We would perform without speaking, relying entirely on posture, gesture, and expression. It was a challenge that felt equal parts intimidating and thrilling. I slid into the corset, feeling the familiar compression, the heightened awareness, the pull toward elegance and poise. Mark mirrored me, adjusting his own posture, smoothing down his scarf with a seriousness that made me pause. We were silent, but in that silence, every movement carried weight, meaning, and vulnerability. I began to walk across the room, trying to convey confidence and subtle grace. Each step required concentration, each sway of my hips demanded mindfulness. I felt exposed in a new way, observed not through words but through the unspoken language of body and presence. Mark followed, his movements exaggerated and expressive, and together we began a silent conversation, a dance that revealed facets of our personalities that words could never capture. At one point, I caught Mark watching me closely. His eyes held something more than amusement. They held curiosity, admiration, and a sense of shared wonder. It struck me how much trust was involved in this process. Not physical trust, but the kind of trust that lets you expose parts of yourself normally hidden from everyone else. I felt a connection that went beyond friendship, beyond comedy, beyond challenge. It was profound and deeply human. The silence was broken only by the occasional laughter when one of us stumbled, nearly losing balance in the corset. Each interruption was a reminder that while the transformation was serious in its lessons, it was also meant to be joyful, light, and playful. We laughed harder than I had expected, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, yet beneath the laughter was an undercurrent of awe and understanding. After several rounds of this silent performance, we collapsed onto the floor, breathless and elated. Mark rolled onto his side, propping his head on his hand, grinning. "We're kind of amazing at this," he said, voice quiet but proud. I nodded, feeling the truth of his words ripple through me. "Yeah," I whispered, "we are." And not just because we can pull off a corset or makeup, because we actually see ourselves differently now. We spent the next hour reflecting aloud, discussing how the challenge had changed our perception of identity, confidence, and self-expression. I realized that the corset, the scarves, the makeup, it had all been a vehicle for something larger, something personal. The physical transformation forced introspection, curiosity, and courage. I had discovered a freedom in play, an authenticity in vulnerability, and a joy in seeing myself in ways I had never allowed before. By the end of the day, the room felt almost hallowed. The mirror reflected more than just our altered appearances. It reflected our growth, our trust, and our shared journey into the unknown. I caught my reflection and smiled, realizing that even without the corset, the hats, and the makeup, a part of me had fundamentally shifted. There was a new awareness of my posture, my gestures, and my presence. The challenge had become a lesson in embodiment, courage, and identity, leaving me changed in ways I hadn't anticipated but was grateful for. Mark, noticing my thoughtful expression, leaned back and said softly, "You know, it's more than a challenge now. It's discovery." I nodded, a quiet laugh escaping me. "Yeah," I said, "discovery, and maybe a little magic too." The final day of our ultimate cross-dressing challenge felt different from the rest. There was a weight of anticipation in the air, not because we were nervous about the corset or the scarves, but because we both sensed that something had shifted, something deeper than mere play. The living room, which had hosted laughter, experimentation, and quiet reflection for nearly a week, now felt like a sacred space, a witness to the journey we had shared. Mark was already there, adjusting the scarves and hats he had become so comfortable with, and I watched him for a moment, noticing how natural his movements had become. Gone was the awkwardness, the hesitation, the self-consciousness. What remained was grace, curiosity, and confidence, the product of days spent exploring not just external transformation, but internal discovery. I stepped into the corset one last time, feeling its familiar embrace and the subtle pressure it exerted on my body. But this time, the feeling was different. It was no longer constrictive or intimidating. It was a reminder of the journey I had taken, the laughter, the stumbles, the discoveries about posture, presence, and self-expression. As I adjusted the clasps and smoothed out the fabric, I felt a sense of reverence for the process, as if the corset itself had become a symbol of courage and exploration. Mark glanced at me, his eyes reflecting a mix of pride and anticipation. "Ready for the final performance?" he asked. I nodded, feeling a flutter of excitement and nerves. There were no cameras, no audience, no stakes beyond our shared experience, but somehow, that made it even more meaningful. We began slowly, moving across the room with deliberate gestures, testing subtle expressions, tilts of the head, and controlled movements. Every sway, every turn, every glance in the mirror felt charged with significance. We were no longer just experimenting. We were embodying the lessons we had learned. Vulnerability had transformed into confidence. Curiosity had blossomed into understanding. And the laughter, the uncontrollable, liberating laughter, had become a celebration of the selves we were discovering, moment by moment. At one point, I caught Mark studying my reflection. His expression was thoughtful, almost reverent. "You've changed," he said softly. "Not just outwardly. You've got this presence now." I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks, a mix of pride, gratitude, and awe. "So have you," I replied. "We've both changed. And it's not just the corset or the makeup. It's everything in between, the courage, the risk, the play." We spent the next hour experimenting with personas, gestures, and silent communication one last time. Each moment felt like both an ending and a culmination. The room held our memories, the laughter, the quiet reflections, the shared discoveries, and yet it felt ready to witness one final transformation. We moved in sync, understanding each other's rhythms, nuances, and intentions without words. It was effortless, fluid, and profoundly intimate in the most human sense. When we finally stepped away from the mirror and removed the corset, there was a moment of quiet stillness. We looked at each other, knowing we had completed more than a challenge. We had created a space where vulnerability, curiosity, and creativity had been nurtured and celebrated. And in that space, we had discovered parts of ourselves we hadn't known existed. The ability to embrace transformation, to inhabit other perspectives, and to experience joy and play without fear of judgment.
Mark collapsed onto the couch with a satisfied sigh.
"We did it," he said. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. "Yeah," I agreed softly. "We really did." As I packed away the scarves, hats, and makeup, I realized that the corset itself had become more than a piece of clothing. It was a symbol, a reminder that transformation is not about perfection or appearance, but about courage, curiosity, and the willingness to explore who you are in ways that surprise and delight you. And though the challenge had ended, the lessons, laughter, and discoveries would linger, shaping how we carried ourselves and saw each other, far beyond the confines of that small living room. We stepped outside into the cool evening air, the fading sunlight brushing our faces, and I felt a sense of liberation unlike anything I had experienced before. The challenge was over, but we were forever changed. And in that moment, I realized that the ultimate cross-dressing challenge had never been about the corset at all. It had been about embracing transformation, daring to explore, and celebrating the freedom of truly seeing and being seen.